Hello and welcome to episode number 3 of JudgeStone. This is Judgment Gaming's weekly-ish, should be weekly from now on, Hearthstone talk show. I am Justice, founder of Judgment Gaming. I am joined by fellow members of my organization. I am joined here by Owen. How are you doing today, bud?
Yeah, pretty good, all right.
Alrighty, and of course our gracious host, Shinfitz. How are you doing?
Yay.
There he is. So why don't you take it away, Fitz, and get us started on today's topics.
All right, let's go ahead and jump in. First topic is probably what most people are talking about as far as Hearthstone goes. How successful do you guys think the recent balance changes were relative to the goals? Most importantly, the Druid deck. Let's start with Mr. Batista.
Well, I'd say overall if the intention of the changes was to, kind of cut the head off of the Hydra, I think that it definitely did the trick. They were minimal changes, but as it turns out, when you change what is arguably the most powerful cards in the game, that is Innervate and Fiery War Axe, you end up changing the texture of the game along with it. So, as of lately, it seems that while the Druid deck is still really powerful, we've seen a bit of a downtick as far as the oppression associated with it. Although we have seen other decks rise up to take its place, it seems like the meta is overall still a bit in flux. So it's maybe a little bit too early to say with any sort of level of certainty whether or not the changes were 100% successful. If the goal was to just make sure that Druid was not as popular on the ladder, I think that if that was the primary goal, then they were pretty successful. What's your take on this, Justice?
I pretty much agree with what you said. It's undeniable that we're seeing less of a Druid presence on the ladder at the moment. People certainly seem to have taken the nerfs into account. With that said, I think that part of its drop in play rate is people saying, okay, Druid isn't as good right now, let me find the next hot thing. Let me try some other stuff, whether that be, casual players that are just, jumping off of the hype train and looking for something else that interests them, or competitive players who are wondering if, okay, now that Druid's been knocked down a peg, is there a new tier 1 deck? Do I just need to play more Razaka's Priest? Is it Tempo Rogue, which we've seen, a huge upswing in play? And they might just be looking for what is that next thing, what is the new, tier 0 deck? So it remains to be seen if the players are dropping Druid somewhat because the nerfs were successful, or if it's just because they're wondering if there is something better out there now, and maybe once that experimentation phase has gone on for a while, if we might just see the players flocking back to Jade Druid. So I think it remains to be seen. Jade Druid is still, I don't think there's much argument that it is still a very strong deck. But the nerfs were designed to make it so that it wasn't that tier 0 deck, which it was before, and that seems at the moment to have been successful, but it's still very possible that it's still a tier 1 deck, so we'll kind of have to wait a bit. I think it's early to call, Jade Druid is, tier 2 now or whatever. I think it's a bit early to say that. I will say that aggro Druid seems to have almost disappeared. I don't know about you guys, but I haven't been seeing much of it at all. The Innervate nerf definitely seems to have driven a lot of players away from that deck. But I think Jade Druid is still very strong. So we'll see where that goes. As far as the rest of the decks go, I want to say the jury's still out on Murloc Paladin specifically. The deck still seems to be pretty reasonable. But as I mentioned, I think in our last episode, it was a deck that was dropping a little bit in strength even before the War Leader nerf. So I think we'll kind of see where that goes. And Pirate Warrior, of course, has dropped precipitously in play rates, although there are still some people trying to make it work, going with a Prince Keliseth version. Just trying that out. And that deck seems to actually just be dropping War Axe completely, because otherwise you have just a glut of 3 drops. Otherwise, you have your South Sea Captain, you have your Bloodsail Cultists, you have your Frothing Berserkers, so adding War Axe on top of that is just a bit too much in the way of 3 drops for a deck that is still looking to get pretty early tempo on the board. So they're going with those Keleseth versions. I don't know how successful those are going to be. Right now, if you want to play Keleseth aggro, Rogue seems to be kind of where it's at, which is a pretty interesting deck. We're seeing both elemental and non-elemental versions having some success at High Legend at ladder, so I'm actually very interested to see where that deck goes. So in creating diversity, I would say it's a success right now, but we just have to see if this is kind of new expansion syndrome, the diversity we get whenever a bunch of new cards are released, and then that diversity kind of drops once people figure out what's actually good and what isn't, or if the changes really have achieved that and now we have more classes that are playable. Because, by the way, Hunter is actually good again, which we couldn't say that a few weeks ago. So yeah, we'll see, and it's possible that we actually do have some more diversity now, which was kind of lacking for a while in the Frozen Throne meta.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you, and certainly Narcotics is expressing frustration that now everybody apparently finally agrees with him that Hunter's good. But yeah, Hunter's actually got a pretty reasonable win rate, at least if we're going by early metrics so far. It also appears that Shaman has a positive win rate, which is good. And as far as I can tell, the other classes don't really have that far off from the 50% win rate either. So if our goal is to create a metagame where all 9 classes have approximately a 50% win rate, then I think ultimately it was successful. Fitz, do you have anything to...
I think Warlock is still struggling a bit. Not the way it was in Ungoro, but it's most pros right now still. Even the ones like, I think it was... Was it Purple who took it? I can't remember if it was Purple in the qualifiers or someone else that like actually took Warlock as one of their tournament decks, and we're still talking afterwards about how weak it is. So like actually thought it was good enough to bring to tournament, and then was still lamenting its weakness afterwards. I certainly don't think it's as bad off as it was, but I think there's still a lot of experimentation going on with it. Some people are trying Zoo again, and some people are just going like a full control Warlock. I've even seen some success from some pros with a questless discard version. So there's still a lot of it. I think there's more experimentation going on with Warlock right now than there is in a lot of other classes. So I think that maybe the perception that it isn't as up to snuff may just be because we haven't landed on that, this is, probably the best Warlock deck right now, and we just haven't gotten there yet. So I think that could be skewing the numbers a little bit against Warlock as well.
Well, one thing I was going to say is that, and I'll keep it brief because I know Fitz had something to say, but I saw that Kibler had been experimenting with the Quest deck, with the Quest Warlock deck, which looked pretty fun, and at least according to HS Replay, the win rate was only of the class overall was like 49.5%, which is still pretty close.
Yeah, but I mean it's certainly reasonable.
Yeah, Fitz.
Well, I was actually going to say, since we don't really know, like, what do you guys think, just real quick, yes or no, is Druid no longer the Tier 1 deck? And if it isn't Tier 1, what deck do you think is? Just if you have to go based on the information that we have today. What do you think, Justice?
I will say... as I said, I don't think it's definite. If I have to just make an educated guess right now, I would say Jade Druid is probably still Tier 1, but not as overbearing as it was. But I don't think it's not Tier 1 anymore. However, strongest deck right now might have shifted to Rizaka's Priest. In the hands of a player who knows what they're doing, because that is actually a very difficult deck to pilot effectively. So I think particularly in the hands of good players who have spent a lot of time with it, I think Rizaka's Priest has probably overtaken Jade Druid, but no, I don't think Jade Druid has fallen out of Tier 1.
What do you think, Digo?
I don't think it is Tier 1 anymore, to be honest.
So what do you think is?
I think that the metagame has fallen to a point where there's probably multiple decks that are Tier 1, but I think that the Prince Keleseth Rogue is probably Tier 1 right now.
It might be.
I don't think that Druid is anymore, because I feel that the Druid deck lost enough power that it can no longer tangle with the Rizaka's Priest, but the Rizaka's Priest crumbles to the Rexar decks, to the Hunter decks that are in the metagame right now, whereas the Rogue decks effectively fight both the Rizakis decks and the Hunter decks. So I feel that the Druid deck is being kept out of tier 1 by Priest, and since Priest is the boogeyman, there are other decks that exist that can successfully prevent it from overwhelming the rest of the metagame.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the second topic. How successful do you guys think the Death Knights are as a new card type, especially alongside quests? This time, let's start with Justice.
I think overall the Death Knights were a bigger success than quests were. I think actually by a fair margin. So in the end, like, people experimented a lot with quests, but in the end,
it doesn't matter.
Doesn't even matter. Quest Rogue had to be nerfed. Interestingly, I will say that, speaking of changes to the meta, it's something that some people are actually playing around with again, is Quest Rogue, even after the nerf, although it's not been met with a lot of success so far, but they've been looking at it kind of as a control killer again, because that's what the deck was doing. It's just obviously not nearly as consistent now after the nerf, so it's been pretty mixed results, but some people are trying it, but overall it's still probably not great at the moment. So Quest Mage is in a decent spot. And the only other quest that really saw any success was Quest Warrior, which has also completely fallen out of favor. So really, we're not seeing a lot of success with quests. It's funny because actually originally it was only Rogue and Warrior. Rogue is more or less gone, and Mage has risen. Quest Mage is a legitimate deck. But that's really it. Like, and Warrior has gone as well. So really, the only quest that's seeing any real amount of play at this point is Mage. So I think quests as a whole were a very cool concept, but there were several flaws in their design. The fact that it has to take up a card in your starting hand is a problem for a lot of decks. The fact that it has to take your turn 1 can be problematic, particularly you look at something like the Hunter quest, where losing your turn 1 to play the quest basically makes playing the rest of the game incredibly difficult. When you're a deck that's trying to play a bunch of 1-drops, so things like that. Obviously, there's certain decks that can deal with it better than others. And then there's just quests that are just underwhelming. You know, Shamans was obviously just not very good. Paladins was not very good. Kibler, you know, being an exception here that we're not going to allow to dictate how strong the card actually was. So there's just a lot of quests that weren't that strong. You know, Priest obviously wasn't that good, and now Priest has a whole lot of better things to be doing than trying to heal to 40. You know, killing your opponent seems to be a slightly more effective win condition than healing to 40.
What do you think about just the mechanic in and of itself, not how good the actual effects are? Like, I think the quest mechanic in comparison to the Death Knight mechanic.
So the thing is this: the quest is. The mechanic itself is cool. Like, you know, it's something that both players are aware of. I'm trying to build up to this big thing, you know, to have this cool payoff. And I think thematically that's very cool. As I said, the problem becomes execution of that, and how reliable it is. And I think compared to Death Knights, the Death Knights all have some sort of impact when they hit play. Right? Whether it be, you know, Anduin destroying all 5-power or more minions, you know, Rexar dealing 2 damage to everybody, Valera even just giving you an extra turn where, you know, your hero just, you know, almost can't take damage outside of, you know, things, untargeted things like, you know, Mind Blast or something. You know, or say the Paladin or Warrior, which gives you, you know, a very good weapon to use. They all have immediate impact. Whereas the quests are things that have to take a turn, have to take a card slot in your deck and a card in your opening hand, and then you still have to work really hard to fulfill the conditions. And honestly, for some of the quests, I don't even feel that they have a bigger impact than some of the Death Knights do. And the Death Knights just require you to play that one card, whereas the quests require you to, for the most part, you know, build around them and play around them. So I think that's why we've seen a lot more Death Knights see success. So, like, just to run down real quick, obviously we all know Anduin is great. Malfurion is obviously very good. Garrosh, even while we weren't sure exactly, Dead Man's Hand Warrior has become a thing. Like, for better or worse, this has become a real deck that people are bringing to tournaments now. So, like, Garrosh is good. Uther maybe isn't as good, but some people are still, trying to make it work, going for the Beardo OTK, whatever. Jaina is very good. Valeera isn't as good as the others, but is still seeing play in pretty much any rogue deck. So while the objective power level of Valeera compared to the others might be slightly lower, she's still showing up in pretty much every rogue deck, which means this is still a card, worth playing, so this is still good. So, like, you go down the list, Thrall, obviously very good for Evolve Shaman, which, as Owen pointed out, is looking to be in a pretty strong spot right now. Like, you go down the list, and, like, the Death Knights all seem to have a place somewhere, whereas most of the quests don't. So I think that Blizzard probably learned a little bit from the quests. I mean, obviously they're not designing, one expansion, only after the other. They're, working way ahead. The next expansion after Knights of Frozen Throne is, probably more or less finished at this point, with some tweaks being available. But, so they do work far ahead. They're not, working only one expansion at a time. But I think that some of the lessons learned from quests were applied to Death Knights. And so overall, yeah, the general power level of Death Knights, the general playability of Death Knights seems to be far and away much higher, much better compared to quests. So I think quests are very cool. And I think it's something they could even revisit in the future. I don't think it's something that has to be exclusive to Ungoro. I think it's something they could come back and revisit in the future. Maybe, taking some of the things that worked with Death Knights and, seeing if there's a way that they can make quests still fair, but maybe a little more interesting to play. So I don't think it's a completely failed design, but I think it's something that they could learn from and do a little better in the future if they choose to.
Well, I was going to say, personally, I think quests are healthier for the game. I think Death Knights are a little less healthy because I like the idea of you having to build around the quests. They just have to really basically have a better effect, because if the quest, once completed, gave you armor, gave you something else, and then did their effect, then I think they would be probably more played. But Big O, rather, what would you say?
I mean, overall, if I had to just say, like, in a vacuum, whether or not the Death Knights were successful in their design, I'd say probably too much. I mean, Blizzard has gone through a lot of trouble to try and slow down the metagame to a point where the Death Knights are relevant. So it's like, were they successful? Well, in the initial implementation, not really, because we ended up in a situation where it was just Malfurion and Shadowy Branduin. And even now, I would argue that the implementation is still not very good, because, like, ultimately you want to have reasons to play the Death Knight and reasons to not play the Death Knight. And as of right now, there's virtually no reason to not play the Death Knight in all of your decks. There's very few choices involved as to whether or not you should play the card. If the only good version of any given class's deck involves playing the Death Knight. So I would say that the implementation is better in that, yes, some of them are seeing play and others aren't, unlike the quests, but I don't like where they are right now. I feel that the power level of a lot of the Death Knights is a bit off, and I think it creates unhealthy play patterns for the game. So I would say I don't think they were particularly successful, in that you don't want a card that's just always going to be in your deck. And while that's maybe a little hyperbolic for some classes, I feel that definitely Druid, Priest, and other, several other of the Death Knights, like, Shaman for the most part, is always going to have a place in your, in your Shaman, Priest, deck. So, I don't know, I'm not really happy with the implementation. I feel like some of the powers are, like, some of the effects are just too much. And they're just not really, I think it just creates some unfun play patterns, I guess. So, overall, I don't think that they were successful. Well, if their goal was to make sure they saw play, then yes, they were successful. But I think that they were maybe a little bit too pushed, whereas I feel like the quests were maybe not pushed enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think you actually hit on a really important point there. which was, if they're auto-include like in any deck played by that class, because wasn't that kind of the point of some of these balance changes, like Fiery War Axe, for example, was, well, we don't just want this card, have to be an auto-include in every deck. But then, as you said, especially for certain classes, it definitely feels that way with their Death Knights. And I think the other problem that we come up with too, and again, you're talking about power level, and I agree with you, is I'll kind of combine both your points together, because as you're talking about the idea of maybe sometimes you want to play a quest and sometimes you don't, depending on how you want to build your deck. And I think that's the ideal scenario, is if I want to build a certain type of deck, the quest or the Death Knight makes sense for me. But not, I will never play this quest ever because it's just bad, and not, I must play this Death Knight in every deck I ever create because it's just too good not to play. And I think we want to see some middle ground there, because there are definitely those games, whether it be the mirror match or even two different decks against each other, where sometimes it just feels like whoever draws their Death Knight first wins, or whoever gets to play their Death Knight first wins. And that's definitely not what I would classify as a success in terms of the card. So I agree with you, Owen. If the idea of success was just, will these cards see play, then yeah, resounding success. But if we're looking for some balance of, because Blizzard, I think, or Team 5, they generally talk about that idea of cards should always be a choice of, if I want to construct a certain type of deck, I do want to play this card. If I want to construct a different type of deck, I don't want to play this card, I want to play something else instead. They talk about that a lot. Like, that is generally their goal. So if we take them at their word, and we assume that goal also applied to Death Knights, then I agree with Owen that it was not a success. Because again, there, especially for certain classes, especially something like, particularly if you look at something like Malfurion, you don't have to build a deck around Malfurion for him to be good. He's just good in any Druid deck that you're going to build. Like, even some of the token Druids ended up putting him in there anyway. There's no Druid deck right now that I can think of that there's not at least consideration for running Malfurion for, because he's just generally good, because he's not doing anything incredibly specific. He's just being generally powerful. Whereas Anduin, you could at least argue, okay, well, it makes the most sense to play a Highlander deck with Raza because of the synergy with the hero power. You don't have to do that. Like, there's some big priests that are still playing Anduin. They're not playing Raza. The hero power is never free. But they're still playing it because it's just a generally strong card. So yeah, if we're looking for that balance of this card is strong in certain types of decks and not others, and it's a choice of when you want to play it, then yeah, they probably missed the mark a little bit by maybe over pushing the Death Knights.
Yeah, and I feel that for one reason or another, this game, like Hearthstone in general, feels like they'll create something that gives design space, but then never really fully explore it. Like, they'll just kind of move on. Like, they had the quests. Instead of having another set that maybe did another set of quests, they just moved on to Death Knights, the new, like, shiny thing, I guess, instead of really exploring that design space. Which I guess kind of leads us to what competitive play looks like right
now. Can I interrupt with something that we hadn't talked about before, so I'm going to surprise both of you, but it's like I've been thinking about and I want your opinions on it, because it actually kind of leads from what we were just talking about. So sorry, Fitz. Okay. But yeah, I actually want to pose this question to you guys. It's going to be a little bit long. It's going to be a little bit complicated, so bear with me. And for our viewers,
take notes?
You might want to. For our viewers, I do want to say this was not part of our pre-show notes. This is completely going to be something different for these guys to think about. But I was thinking about this the other day, and I want your guys' opinion. So for those who don't know us, all three of us played Yu-Gi-Oh! At least semi-competitively for a long time.
Yu-Gi-Oh!
Thank you. So it's a game that we all spend a lot of time. We've all been out of the game for a long time, but we spent many years with it. It's actually how all of us met. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we'd know each other if it weren't for Yu-Gi-Oh!, right? Mm-hmm. So the game will always have a special place in my heart because of that, because I met two of my closer friends from it. But B, here's what I was thinking the other day. One of my favorite things to do in Yu-Gi-Oh! Was deck construction. And just coming up with different things. Some ideas worked, some didn't. But coming up with sometimes, some more meta decks, sometimes completely, off the wall. Obviously, all of us have spent time playing decidedly non-meta decks, whether it be my Reversal Quiz or Bad Reaction to Smochi decks, or Owen's Last Turn, or Fitz, I don't remember, but I know you've done some crazy stuff yourself.
Water.
Water.
Always the water deck.
That's true. That's true.
Or the Silent
Um,
Swordsman.
yes, yes. So we've all spent a fair bit of time really theory crafting a lot of different stuff. Some of it worked, some of it didn't. Although I will say that all of us have experienced at least some success with non-meta decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! At one point or another. Things that we kind of theory crafted on our own and then play tested with each other. And that was really one of my favorite things to do. Was really deck building and theory crafting and all of that. And I will say, and this is where the question is going to get complicated, because I'm going to kind of pose the question, but then keep going after that. So I'll let you know when I'm done rambling. My question is this. I have pretty much never felt that same thrill or excitement for deck building with Hearthstone that I ever did with Yu-Gi-Oh! And so my question is this. Is it because I'm just older now and I just don't have the same mindset? B, is it because while we definitely had internet resources at the time with Yu-Gi-Oh! With Hearthstone being a digital game, at least to me, it seems like the resources are far greater with Hearthstone, and particularly the speed at which they come out. I don't remember ever seeing, and maybe it's just me. Maybe I just didn't look in the right places. But I definitely feel the flow of information is much faster in Hearthstone, and there's much more of it compared to what I had with Yu-Gi-Oh! And again, maybe that's just me. Maybe that was, maybe other people were getting that amount of information. But is it just that, so that the best decks are just that quickly figured out, and it's just very clear these are the deck lists you're playing if you want to win, or else you're playing bad decks? Is some combination of these things? Is it something else, or is it something about the way that Hearthstone generally does push their cards and push their deck types? In that, to me, I at least personally don't feel that same level of freedom, because I feel, to me, like Yu-Gi-Oh! Always had those crazy decks that had just enough cards that synergized together that you could theory craft a deck list, even if it wasn't a tier 1 deck. That they had those weird things, like Bad Reaction to Smoke. I'm just use as an example because that was a deck that I loved playing. That was never a tier 1, never a tier 2 or tier 3 probably even deck, but it had enough, because Bad Reaction to Smochi existed. It was a card that basically existed on its own. It said there is no deck archetype built around this card. And for those who are unfamiliar with Yu-Gi-Oh!, I should probably specify, it was a card that stayed in play. That stated whenever a player would gain life from a card effect, they lose that much instead.
It's basically Alchanizo Priest.
Basically Alchanizo Priest, but affects everything. So yeah, basically Alchanizo Priest. Except it didn't affect monsters, I don't think. I think it was just the player themselves. Well, yeah, because monsters.
Well, because in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yeah,
you
it
can
works
monsters.
differently. Yeah. Anyway, yes. So it was just a card that existed that they basically just printed and said, hey, figure out if you want to do something with this. It's probably not great, but there were enough cards that you could make work with it that you could theory craft a deck, which it did. And it was a fun deck to play, and it could win games. It could win games not only against other bad decks. It wasn't favored against the good decks of the meta, but it at least had a chance, with a decent draw. So I felt, it feels to me, and again, if I'm off here, I want you guys to tell me, because this is just what I've felt. It felt to me like there was slightly more room for experimentation and for kind of off-the-wall stuff that could still work in at least a limited sense, compared to Hearthstone, where I feel like certain deck types are maybe pushed a little bit harder, and where I personally feel like there's slightly less creative space to work in from a deck building perspective. So that's my long rant, and maybe you guys don't feel the same way at all, and that's okay. I'm just curious. As to people who played Yu-Gi-Oh! for approximately the same amount of time that I did, and that also enjoyed creating kind of crazy decks, if you guys have felt that same way or not.
All right. Yeah, sure. I'll take it away. So, in short, I feel like this may just be a change of priority with you.
Mm-hmm.
You said it yourself. You were fine if the decks weren't tier 1. You just wanted to play them and have the fun exploring it. Well, there are plenty of decks that aren't tier 1 now, but you don't build them because they don't win. So I think with you, it's maybe you value winning more than you did prior to that, and so you don't feel the drive to try and brew new things, because I feel that perhaps you assume to yourself that, well, any sort of time you'd be able to spend with a thing, you would, someone else will discover it before you do. One thing that Yu-Gi-Oh didn't have that we have nowadays, and it's something that Magic actually struggles with, just from my Magic background, is the velocity in which metagames are broken, due in large part to the digital element of both Magic and Hearthstone. So with Yu-Gi-Oh, there was never really a true digital element to Yu-Gi-Oh.
Right.
It was a completely tactile card game where, if you want to get, ahead in the meta, well, metas were like largely concentrated due to like local stuff. I'm sure if you experienced this when you moved out to California, am I right? Where the metagame was just totally different.
To a sense, yeah. In a sense, rather.
Right. So Yu-Gi-Oh had a thing that was going on where there was a lot of like local metagames, and since there was no like centralized place to play each other, any sort of information you would get from a tournament report would kind of be of like limited usefulness, because there isn't one like conglomerate of a metagame. It's several regional metagames that then come together for larger tournaments. So I think it's like Yu-Gi-Oh has that advantage in that the metagames are never really truly solved before the next set comes out or before the next deck is made. At least from when we played the game.
Right,
That's a bit different now, of course, because it's different now because Yu-Gi-Oh is just a much faster game. So like the decks are much more decidedly like this is the best deck. I mean, they were back in the day as well, but anyway, Magic has this problem. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, Magic has this problem where metagames are broken very quickly, and a lot of it just has to do with data access. You can find the best decks, but I think that you can still build like subpar decks and still do okay with them. I mean, I've been doing it the first couple of weeks after the change with an aggressive priest deck that I basically brewed from like a bare bones list that I found online, and I utilize that as like a skeleton. But so like it's not that brewing can't be done. It's just I think that perhaps your priorities and the amount of time that you're able to sink into it are just different than when when you were younger.
Yeah, well, there's no question. I definitely have less free time for sure. So yeah, I could see how that would affect my prioritization on decks that I know are strong and capable of winning. Because if I'm only able to sit down, for a little bit of time, you're saying I only have a little bit of time to devote to it. I could definitely see how that would be a factor.
That's.
I disagree, actually. I think, well, number one, the point that you made about Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't think that that's necessarily true. There were places like Pojo where I think there were very much a hive mind mentality where people figured out, like I remember distinctly before the Chaos deck came out, there were lists on Pojo basically on what the Chaos deck would look like, the best kind of refined version of it, and that's what people ended up playing at the time. Like I think that there was like people were able to crack the metagame as soon as they found out the cards, especially since it was a Japanese game. They would see the Japanese cards, proxy the cards, play it, find out what was good, post it on Pojo. Everyone else would try it and then post their results. So they very much were able to find out the metagame. But getting to your point, Justice, there really isn't a lot of room for, well, yes and no as far as experimentation goes. So we have the 9 different classes, and you can try like different decks with the 9 different classes, which is kind of cool because they're all kind of good. You know what I mean? Like there isn't anything that's just complete garbage. There's no like wind deck in in Hearthstone the way there was in Yu-Gi-Oh. However, in Hearthstone, there's essentially 3 ways to win. You win through damage with minions, damage through spells, or fatigue. Like every class has to do it that way. So yeah, you make like for example a crazy off the wall deck, maybe Shaman Freeze. You know, you're still trying to win with damage through minions, so it doesn't really feel like what is there really to experiment? They're basically telling you how to play the game, and then you kind of execute. So yeah, I agree with
Right.
you. I don't think there's a lot of experimentation as far as the game goes, just because the effects are so controlled. So there is a bad reaction to Samuchi deck in this game, but because we have so little card types, it's more easily like answered because a
Right.
lot of these effects are in the like there is no skill drain card where I can just like defend this trap card or defend this something that isn't a monster. Everything is kind of tacked on as a monster effect. So any
Right.
long term game plan can be interacted with basically attacking.
Right. So kind of to your point then. So there are no mechanics that allow for something like say my reversal quiz deck or Owen's last turn deck. There are no mechanics that allow for a deck like that to exist, which is not the only way to have diversity experimentation, mind you. It's just one type of example, but because Hearthstone aims to be a very accessible game, particularly for those that haven't played card games before. Someone who's never played a card game before, I can't just sit down in 5 minutes and explain how reversal quiz works, right? Like that's just fair. That's just not going to happen.
I mean,
I mean,
honestly,
hell.
I've seen you.
Yeah.
Just to interject in
Yeah.
there, I've honestly seen you sit down from players who've played Yu-Gi-Oh for years and didn't understand how that
Right,
deck worked.
that's what I was just
maybe
gonna
not the best
say.
example.
Yes, yeah, where I literally
But
was
it
at
did-
tournaments and had to explain to my opponents why they just lost.
But
Yes.
it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be as like convoluted as reversal quiz.
Sure.
I think there should just be alternate ways of doing things that maybe and I don't know the fact that everything is so controlled in the classes. There aren't a lot of like universal things where it's just like here's this thing and kind of see where it fits, kind of put it
Right.
where you choose.
Right.
It really does hamper what what you can do deck wise, especially when every set comes out and then it's like, here is your like they give you the recipe, like here is what we want you to do with the cards that we created, and even
Well,
if
I
Go ahead.
can see Owen has been like itching to get in there. Go ahead.
it
Well, what I was going to say is that like a lot of the problem here stems from, and actually, ironically, you and I, we all three of us have experience with a custom card game that we all had played, Hans's game.
Mm.
But a lot of the problem is that the game segments the actual cards released. So every expansion, each class only is getting maybe like a half a dozen or a dozen cards, which ultimately translates to each class's individual card pool just not being all that expansive. So I think that a lot of the problem, as far as like experimentation goes, has less to do with the idea of like, oh well, they tell you how to play the game. I mean, Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh and other things have been telling you how to play the game for a long time.
Sure.
I think the problem stems from more so that we don't have enough cards available to us for any given class to do something other than that.
Can
and
I actually ask Issa a question then? Actually, based on that.
Mm.
Because Hearthstone's release schedule is actually significantly slower than a lot of other card games. Like a lot more cards are injected into Yu-Gi-Oh, and I don't know about Magic, but I'm going to assume so probably. But let's just take Yu-Gi-Oh as example, as the game that I know. A lot more cards are injected, say per year, into Yu-Gi-Oh than they are in Hearthstone. Do you feel like that's a factor in that?
Yes, definitely.
I don't think so.
Okay, I mean,
Well, and
basically
why don't you explain why, and then I'll be interested to hear if it's his counterpoint.
Okay. So I think that it's one of the biggest factors in allowing creativity, because I feel that by limiting, by only introducing like a handful of, like for instance, a legendary card, has like a certain power level associated with it, but each class only gets 2 of them per set, basically. I think that if the sets were like 2 or 3 times larger than they currently are, yeah, you might have a certain number of cards that are forcing a particular strategy down your throat, but that also leaves enough room to flash out older strategies that maybe they've forgotten about, or to just make general cards and just let players do what they want. I think because the sets have limited design space, and because they want to push interesting new ways to play, I think that it prevents them from being able to attribute enough card slots to just like random interesting effects to allow players to come up with new and interesting ways to play. So, and I think that part of the reason we were able to get those fun, interesting decks with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is because you could always play every card you wanted to. Whereas in this game, if there's a, interesting card from Hunter and you see it combines interestingly with another class, there's no way to do that consistently. So even when you do find interesting interactions, unless the designers have decided that's an interaction you want to do, there's no way to really capitalize on it. Whereas I think that, one way to solve that problem is to allow for more cards in every set, which allows the designers more leeway to put more generalized cards in the expansion that don't necessarily cater to a particular playstyle.
Okay. That's interesting.
We're kind of running out of time, guys. So just real quick, one more thought on this for everyone, and then we'll move on. Okay. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's a mentality thing, because there's, for example, games, and I know neither of you have played this game, but Owen a little bit. In Dragon Ball, it's a very similar deck building style, and there was very much a as far as deck experimentation goes, that same I guess mentality was there, even though the play style was similar to Hearthstone as far as making decks go. So I think it's a mentality thing, not necessarily the fact that you're limited. But in any case, we're kind of running out of time. Let's do one more thought, and then we'll.
Yeah, actually, my last thought is just maybe this will be a discussion that's worth its own video. I wanted to bring it up because it was relevant to what we were talking about, but I think there's actually more space that we can explore here. So maybe we'll let our see if there's any YouTube comments. This is something people want to see, but I think maybe this is actually worth the three of us doing a separate video on. That's my last thought, because I actually think it's a really interesting thing to talk about now that we're getting into it, and I like that we have some different viewpoints. So I think this might be worth discussing further at a different time. So yeah, let's move on.
Okay, well then, yeah, let's wrap it up with the last point. What is this? Okay.
We lost Fitz's video. Now we have his pretty face. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Everyone's thought on competitive play. Where it's at, do we like it? If there needs to be a change, what would that change be?
I'm gonna let Owen take the lead on this one, because I have some thoughts, but I'm gonna let Owen take the lead, because I know he's pretty passionate about this. I'm gonna let him take the lead, and then I'll follow up.
Okay.
Sure. I mean, it's my personal opinion that I don't think competitive play is very good. I think that it has this air of exclusivity to it, and I think the way for qualifying for like the larger events is very like, oh, just hit top 100 ladder, and it's like, all right, well then what? I mean, I think that Blizzard has a really big problem with just being kind of like public and open with like the levels of progression. I also think that the idea of, you have to qualify for the big tournaments by doing well in ladder doesn't make sense, because it's kind of like qualifying for, it's kind of like saying in order to play in this, badminton tournament, you have to win this tennis tournament first. It's like, yeah, they're kind of similar, but there's still different skills involved. Whereas I think that I don't like that the competitive play circuit is attached to the ladder in the way that it is. And I think that, the smaller tournaments don't have enough, kind of like support on the mothership end, like on Blizzard's end. One thing that I think that like Magic does well, for instance, is it has a very clear set of progression. There are Pro Tour qualifying events, then there's the Pro Tour, there's Grand Prix, which are not associated with that, but they're events that get coverage. Whereas I think Hearthstone has a really big problem with providing like a consistently visible way for players to get involved. If there's a Pro Tour qualifying event, anybody can go to that, and I don't have to rank up in on Magic Online in order to qualify for that event if I don't want to. I can get there a different way. So I think like by demanding like a certain number of man hours just to get to the higher level tournament structure, I think it makes it kind of too exclusive. and prevent other players from really enjoying that style of play, which I think ultimately hurts the game. Because honestly, Conquest and other similar tournament formats are some of the more interesting ways to play the game. And by not allowing players to see that part of it, I think that the game does itself a really big disservice. I'm not advocating to like eliminate the winter championships or the summer championships or the HTC events or whatever. I think you can keep those in place, but I think they need to do a better job of promoting smaller scale events that promote players gathering and actually doing the thing, as opposed to what they do now, where they spend a ton of money on high level production for maybe 5 or 6 tournaments a year or whatever the number is, and the way to actually qualify for those tournaments is like very difficult to either difficult to find out or difficult to understand, or requires an absurd amount of man hours to get into it. Like, as of today, I still am not 100% sure how to qualify for which of those tournaments and what order those tournaments are in, or what relevance either of those tournaments have in relation to one another. So, I mean, maybe this is more showing my ignorance on the matter, but I feel that Blizzard could do a much better job of marketing these things.
Justice?
Yeah, he's spot on. And I think even that last point is maybe one of the most important things. The amount of visibility and transparency is way low. I'll say this. I'll admit I haven't looked at it from the perspective of really going in-depth research of, okay, if I want to qualify, for ultimately if my goal is to get to BlizzCon, what do I do to get there? I have a general idea, and I've spent more time looking at it than no one has. Not as much as if I really needed to know, but like I have a better idea than he does, but I'm still not 100% clear on some of these things. I agree that ladder performance having any impact on your ability to get to bigger tournaments is ridiculous. They really are two completely different things. It's been proven, at least to say get to Legend. Your best course of action is just play aggro. Like that's just true. Just from a time perspective, if you have a limited amount of time, you can have a similar win rate with aggro or control. Aggro is going to be much more effective, as far as time goes. But playing an all aggro lineup, depending on the metagame in a tournament, might just get you, whatever drop. Might not necessarily be your best course of action. And of course, playing a best of 5 is very different than just playing best of 1s on ladder, especially with a ban, worrying about what decks to queue up at what time. These are very different skill sets. Plus, there's the grind of a tournament.
Deck construction is entirely different too.
For sure. Because when you're putting together your tournament lineup, you're thinking about, okay, what decks am I targeting? What decks am I weak to? What am I planning on banning if my opponent brings it? And if I ban this one deck, is the rest of my lineup okay? Or do I have this glaring weakness that I can't get rid of with just one ban? So do I need to switch out one of these decks for something else that'll allow me to take care of that weakness? And what I was just about to say is the grind of a tournament too. You can sit there for a few hours a day playing a ladder in the comfort of your own home. That's a whole lot different than going and traveling to an event. Or even some events allow you to play at home, but playing those 8, 9, 10, 11-hour days and having to wait in between matches and having that downtime and not just doing it on your own schedule, those are huge differences. Those are not the same thing at all. So yeah, it is a problem. Now, the one thing I will bring up, and something that's been discussed I think for a long time now, is having in some way tournament support in client. This is important not only for the reasons that we've talked about just now, but also because of the problems that currently exist with tournaments in Hearthstone, even the big ones. You have issues, disconnects. We've seen even the last big tournament in the prelims. That was a huge problem. There was B. Laker who had a game where there was no way he could have lost from the position he was in. He was playing control deck. He was up against a Pirate Warrior who's basically out of cards, out of threats. There was really no way for him to lose, and then there was a disconnect. But because the rules on disconnect state that unless there is lethal on board, it's a regame, they had to regame it because there was no lethal on board. And it was a game that he clearly could not have lost in any conceivable fashion. But because they had to remake it and start from the beginning, he actually ended up losing. And it cost him a match in the tournament. That's a problem. Disconnects are a real problem, especially with some of the venues that Blizzard is currently choosing are not being vetted properly for their ability to handle a large load on their servers. So that's a problem. You have problems with even things like, because people are playing obviously on their own accounts and not on a tournament account, it's really hard to police, say, things like cheating via chat, of people messaging you. If a tournament admin does not catch, especially at a smaller tournament, if a tournament admin does not catch that someone's, say, messaging you, like watching a stream and giving you information that you shouldn't have, it's actually really difficult to police that in a lot of circumstances. It's very difficult to police intentional disconnects. Because of the rules that exist, someone could, accidentally kick the router that's underneath their table, or quickly disconnect an Ethernet cable and, I disconnected, guess we have to remake. It's, in a lot of cases, very difficult to police that kind of thing. And a lot of this is solved by having, A, better rules in place for disconnects, and B, having better in-client tournament support.
So what would be one, for each of you, what would be one, solution that you would, like you said, have better rules. What does that mean?
That I haven't put a whole lot of thought into, so I'd have to get back to you on that. I'm sure there are ways to do this. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I do have the answer to that. Just kidding. Have the answer. The answer is, like in other competitive games, have a way to resume a game from a certain state. So it exists now in League of Legends. It exists, I believe, in StarCraft, which is a Blizzard game. So the technology is there. It should be easier in Hearthstone since it's basically always, with very few exceptions, a static game state. Whereas League of Legends, StarCraft, there's a bunch of moving parts all at once. Hearthstone is a card game. It should be theoretically easier to resume from a certain spot in Hearthstone compared to those other games. They just haven't prioritized getting that technology into the Hearthstone client. The technology exists, and Blizzard as an overall company, obviously different teams work on different games, but Blizzard as an overall company already has that technology. So that needs to be prioritized higher, because when you're having a game that, while it wasn't originally intended to be a huge esport, has become one, the success of this is greatly dependent upon your credibility. And part of your credibility is the ability to deal with things like disconnects, because, yeah, sometimes it can be intentional, but sometimes, as I said, it's not intentional. Most of the time it's not. It's, things happen with internet, even with great internet. Like, this is just something that will happen sometimes. You need to have a plan in place. And the plan of, if there's no lethal on board, we just remake the game, is not a great plan. It has a lot of flaws to it. But if we can, say, resume the game from the state right before the disconnect, which, again, technology exists for it. This is not just me, pie in the sky dreaming. This exists. It just hasn't been a priority to put it in the client. So I think, above all else, if they do nothing else, and I think there are other things they need to do also for a good tournament, like putting a ban system in client, again, having tournament support rather than having to do this separately. There's other things too, but if they did nothing else, prioritizing establishing that technology in Hearthstone to be able to resume from the states that disconnect, do not completely change the game, that would be the one thing I would say they have to do above all else to preserve tournament integrity.
What do you say, Big O?
Piggybacking on that, I feel that one way to implement that, as far as actual, coding, is hypothetically they install a tournament game mode where 8 people on the same Wi-Fi network 8 or more people can join up into the structure, and basically have something written in the client where if one or more players disconnect from a match, it snapshots the current game state and then maybe saves it temporarily in a cloud or something for 5 or 10 minutes or something. And then if both players are back online at the same time, the game would automatically reconnect to that game state. And then have some sort of time period there where it's if neither player reconnects, if neither player can reconnect within the time frame, be it 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or whatever, then the game is, considered a draw or a double loss or whatever it is you want to do with it, or remake the game or whatever. But I think just some sort of architecture in place to allow for, because clearly snapshotting every game that takes place is not doable, which is why the current disconnect methodology exists, is because currently it's client-wide. If you and I are playing on ladder and one of us disconnects, well, then that's it. The game's lost. It's not saved. But because of the number of games that are completed on Hearthstone, we can't very well expect them to snapshot every single game that ever has a disconnect in it that's not realistic. But if it were a particular mode, and then the client only does it for games in this particular mode, then I could see how that might be something. Because the game already does this with solo games, where if you disconnect from a solo game, like a solo adventure game, where you're just playing against the AI and there's no time limit on your turn, you can reconnect to that game within, 3-4 minutes of getting disconnected. So the technology exists to some level in the client already. It's just a matter of and it's not an insignificant amount of work to create a tournament structure to do, like a tournament architecture within the client to do that. That's a significant amount of work to be done. But that's one way they could go about doing it. As far as changes that I would make, though, that are less systematic as far as that is concerned, I think an easy change that Hearthstone and Blizzard in general could make today would be just highlighting smaller events on their main page and disconnecting the need to grind on ladder in order to get to the larger events. It would be my personal preference to have a tournament circuit of sorts, as opposed to a grind on ladder and then attend whatever championship you qualified for, if that's how it's done. I think that featuring those kind of events on your primary website is a good idea. I think that Blizzard needs to work on its communication a lot. But that's a change that I would make if I worked, hypothetically, I were the CEO of Blizzard and I was in charge of these decisions. Today, I would immediately basically remove still allow for the qualification of ladder. Like, let's say top 100 ladder will get a qualification or whatever it is, or top 50 ladder gets a qualification to this event, but also allow players to enter that event by qualifying at smaller events. So to not remove the importance of grinding on ladder, allow players to do that if that's what they want to do, but also provide other players who maybe don't have the time to grind a legend, to give them the opportunity to attend a tournament somewhere and then qualify that way. Because I feel that you lose a lot of potentially great players for the game by limiting it to the subsection of players who can afford to grind out to the top 50 or top 100 legend every month. Because if you think about it, there are right now like a disproportionate number of players who hit that benchmark who stream professionally. Those people stream professionally because they have a following, because they can consistently make those events, in part. So it's kind of like a self-feeding cycle where these players can afford to spend more time playing this game because they effectively can get paid to stream this game because they get the face time when they go to these events, which they qualify for by spending the time playing in the first place. So that would be what I would do.
That's something that a lot of competitive stuff kind of falls into that trap. But speaking about competitive things, since we are pretty much out of time, we are having also a conquest game with who are the two? It's gonna be.
We have
can't even say this guy's name.
We have our returning champion, the guy who won our last exhibition match, Narcotics, will be facing a new challenger. So I'm actually pretty excited to see how that goes, because so far, to this point, no winner has been able to defend their title against their next opponent. We had our first match of me against Owen. Owen won and then lost to Good Life, and then Good Life lost to Narcotics. So now we'll see if Narcotics is able to defend his title. I'm actually really interested to see how that goes. This will also be our first exhibition match that officially is using Knights of the Frozen Throne. The last one kind of unofficially did, just through random effects, but this one officially will be Knights of the Frozen Throne, so it will be our first one doing this as well, since we unfortunately did have to take a little break from it. So I'm actually very, very excited for this. So it will be Tuesday, 9:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Central Time here on this channel. So I'm really looking forward to it. I will be casting it alongside one of you, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. We don't know which one yet. I will be there, for anyone wondering. I will be present, and so will one of these guys. So it should be a lot of fun. So definitely make sure to check it out at the time. Of course, we will have VODs on this website at jdggaming.com or through the YouTube channel as well on Judgment Gaming YouTube if you are unable to catch it live.
Yeah, I didn't know that there was. I didn't even notice that there was never a successful title defense.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. I mean, it's only been a few so far, but yeah, that's it's been failed every time so far. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, given that Hunter is a reasonable deck now, perhaps he has the edge.
Yeah, that's possible. He was playing it when it was considered, garbage. So now he really should be pretty happy.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty good beforehand. To be fair, it's not like any of the tools have changed. So,
Yeah, so we'll see.
Unless he bans
All right.
Hunter, but let's not give him any ideas. Anyway, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Yeah, that would kind of suck. But yeah, so you all, Justice, you kind of already touched on the fact that you can follow us on. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook. There's also a Twitter, and of course, jdggaming.com is where we kind of post all of our stuffs for you to do whatever you do with stuff.
Yes, we do stuff. That is correct. We do stuff, and it goes on a website.
Yeah, and that's where you can see the stuff.
Yes, the website's for this stuff. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you guys Tuesday.
Tuesday.
We will catch you guys
then.
Tuesday.
All right, you guys, take it easy.